Welcome to ePODstemology.
Epistemology. You know what I like a lot more than materialistic things? Knowledge. What is this?
It's a podcast.
Hello everyone, so pleased you can join me for another episode of ePODstemology, where we platform emerging scholars and let them share with you their research passions and path-breaking insights. I'm Dr Mark Fabian, Deputy Director of the Institute for Social Change at the University of Tasmania, and an affiliate fellow at Cambridge University's Bennett Institute for Public Policy. My guest this episode is Dr Kitty O'Loan from Cambridge's Woolf Institute. She's a social psychologist by training, specialising in moral cognition and the cognitive science of religious experience. She joins me to talk about her past work on interfaith dialogue, her imminent study of forgiveness, and her research dreams of studying the secular benefits of religious practices. Please join us for really quite a lovely chat.
ePODstemology.
Okay, so welcome Kitty O'Loan to ePODstemology.
Well, thank you very much, Mark. It's really nice to be here. Thank you.
So we always start the same way on the show, which is that I just ask people to tell us a little bit about their research and why they're excited about it. And so go right ahead.
Great. Well, I suppose I would say I'm a social psychologist. So I did my PhD in social psychology, and I was particularly interested in moral cognition and moral behaviour, and particularly how it sort of interacts with religion and religious belief. The first job that I got after my PhD was in absolutely no way connected to research at all. So I feel like for the past sort of 2 years, I haven't been doing anything that's really what I would say my own research. Mm-hmm. But what is amazing is that I wrote a research proposal it'll be last year now, I think, that's got funded. So the new project is starting next week.
Congratulations. Very exciting.
Yeah. Thank you. And it's looking at forgiveness in post-conflict societies. Mm-hmm. So it has this sort of moral cognition element to it, which I'm really excited about. But also it has sort of cross-cultural and interreligious aspects going on as well. So one of the things that we're particularly interested in is how religious conceptualizations of forgiveness vary between religions and between ethnicities, between communities, and how they play out in this post-conflict landscape. And we've had sort of a couple of preliminary meetings, and we've got an amazing, one of the things actually that I'm so excited about is that we have this amazing team of researchers. So we've got sort of computer modelling going on, we've got some AI and some philosophers. You always need a philosopher, a couple of anthropologists. And what I think is the emerging sort of direction that we'll be taking is that we will be looking at forgiveness and how it plays out in the Balkans, particularly amongst sort of the key players involved in the Yugoslav wars in the 1990s. So we have an amazing guy based in the University of Alabama who's done incredible work with sort of Serbian nationalists and Serbian veterans. We have another colleague who I've known for a long, long time, who's based in Croatia and who does very similar things, but with Croatian war vets. And we have recently got on board an anthropologist of religion who has done work looking at sort of sacred landscapes and Bosnian Muslims as well. So we're hoping to bring everybody together, sort of pool the data, and then perhaps run some sort of more on-the-ground studies as well, perhaps some in Bosnia, and really just see what happens. So I feel kind of bad for your listeners that I don't have any concrete grand plan to sort of lay before them. But I think for me what is most interesting is it's this idea of forgiveness and its social function, how the evolution of forgiveness, what benefit does it bring to society, and in some cases is it actually the best course of action? I would argue perhaps not, that in some cases it is more important for a crime or a misdeed, a transgression, to be publicly punished rather than to be forgiven. And I think my hunch at this point, this early stage in the game, is that both forgiveness and punishment are crucial to social stability, and that both are equally important, and that you can't have one without the other.
And what about like revenge? So you've juxtaposed punishment there, but so I know that there is a pretty big literature in social psychology and adjacent fields on the role of revenge.
Yes.
And you probably know this better than me, but I know that there's a lot of studies of the frontier in America, like the Wild West, and that generally frontier and pastoralist societies tend to have way more vengeance dynamics, right? Because my understanding is it's because it's much harder to set up sort of institutional law and order in those kind of settings. And so the kind of rational choice facing people needs to be undergirded by a very strong conviction or a very kind of unshakable belief that if you do the wrong thing, someone will revenge on you at whatever cost it is to that person. So they have to hunt you to the ends of the earth, and they will make sure you pay.
They'll hunt you down like the dog you are.
Yeah, and so even if you think, well, it's not worth it for them to do vengeance on me in this case, like they will do it anyway because otherwise the calculus is such that you should engage in crime.
I mean, that sounds like an extraordinary strategy. Is that sort of sustainable over a long period of time? Well,
I think so. These studies of the American West, and particularly in the South, claim to show that a lot of the culture of present-day American Southwest is essentially a function of this frontier honor culture.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a really interesting question. I mean, where does revenge come into this sort of dyad we've introduced of punishment and forgiveness? Like, it's the obvious question, isn't it? It's like revenge. Also, you could argue, is punishment an aspect of revenge? I would say, I don't know, actually. But intuitively, I don't think it is.
All right.
I think there's something very structured punishment, costly punishment, is something that's crucial for the development of societies and cohesion. And what becomes interesting is when you throw in like a supernatural agent into the mix, and then you're able to offload the responsibility to punishment to the god or gods or whatever it is, so that you have this multi-layered, nuanced conceptualization of punishment, And if it's not, the transgression isn't punished in the here and now, it'll be punished at some point in the sort of eternity. And I remember when I was doing my PhD, actually, one of the studies we ran was based on a study by, I can't remember that, I think it was Karen et al. But it was looking at precisely this idea that if you prime people with a forgiving or punishing God, will they be more or less motivated to invest in state-sanctioned punishment?
All right, okay.
We didn't particularly find anything outrageously interesting, mainly because, as I came to find out, priming is particularly problematic, and it wouldn't be something that I would do now if I were to rerun it. But we did find sort of interesting things sort of pertaining to religiosity. Religiosity was a predictor of if you primed religious people with a forgiving God, they were much more likely to invest in state-sanctioned punishment, and vice versa.
Oh, right. Okay. And so how does social psychology explain these behaviors? So do they have like evolutionary origins, or like what's the story?
Well, yeah, I mean, for me, the general trend seems to be that there's always some kind of ultimate explanation for it. Or for, punishment in particular, there's a huge body of research looking at sort of costly punishment, third-party punishment. And it seems that it's necessary. If everybody transgressed and there was never any sanctioning mechanism, how would you keep society together? Sure. But then, of course, if it's inevitable at some point that people will transgress, not necessarily, commit a terrible crime, but they're going to, at some point, do something that upsets somebody else, or, overcrosses some arbitrary social norm. And what I find interesting is that at what point does punishing every single transgression become so costly that it's counterproductive? So is that then why you have forgiveness? That it sort of mitigates this escalating cost of punishment?
Have you read The Once and Future King by T.H. White?
No.
Oh, So I think this is
should.
like, I definitely think you should. We're in England. I'm not even the Brit here, but I think this is one of Britain's greatest kind of literary works. Yeah.
Isn't it embarrassing? I've never heard of it.
It's so it's a retelling of the Arthurian legends.
Very interesting.
It's interesting because I was about to say it's a modern retelling, but it's actually an obstinately not modern book. So it's got quite a slow pace. It's very hard to read fast. The first third of it or so is actually a children's book about Arthur's life as a child, where Merlin kind of transforms him into various animals, and he learns from the ants, who are kind of a metaphor for communism. And the ravens, and I feel like there's another animal that I'm forgetting. But the second half of the book, I think forgiveness is one of the main themes, because Arthur presides over the court at Camelot, and one of the main kind of undercurrents of that court is that the Irish essentially are always taking vengeance on the Brits and vice versa. And Arthur tries to convince the youngest members of each of these kind of bloodlines to just like cool it. Like don't take vengeance this one time. Just like let it be. And everything will be better, because while we keep taking vengeance, it's just always blood for blood, and it never ends. And that, I guess, speaks to what you just said.
That really does. It also speaks quite loudly to the project on forgiveness that I'm just about to start. This idea that. So one of the things that we're very interested in is the current sort of younger generation in Northern Ireland or Bosnia or Serbia, who were born and grown up outside of the conflict. Mm-hmm. So they've grown up on the narratives of the past, on the narratives of their parents or grandparents who were involved and remember the conflict. How do we stop them sort of falling back on these glorified accounts of what's happened, and sort of how do we
and cleanse that blood?
Well, yeah, exactly. Yeah. Like, where does it end? If it's like literally a tit for tat, blood deserves blood, then it's just never ending, isn't it? Because so yeah, how do you stop that cycle of vengeance and bloodthirsty? I mean, I don't know. And one of we had a conversation yesterday at one of our research meetings, and initially we had this really kind of rosy-eyed, let's put this AI model that will be able to sort of predict peace in these artificially simulated societies. And we had our meeting on the very same day that Russia invaded Ukraine. And actually, what we've come to realise is that's less realistic. What would be more realistic is to have a model that looks at societies that have had recent conflict, and how can we stop them going back into conflict rather than how can we create peace. And it's rather depressing, but I think it's more what can we do in the Balkans to stop it going back into conflict. And as yet, I don't know how the answers, unfortunately. But it'll be very interesting to see, actually, how things, particularly in Serbia, play out after the Russian invasion. So one of the research assistants we have on the project is a girl who is, she's a Bosnian Serb, and she lives in Sarajevo. And one of the things she was really adamant about was this is not a post-conflict society.
Oh, right.
She said, people think that, but it's not. If you live here, it's a conflicted society. There's constant sort of trickles of violence and repercussions and all the rest of it. And with the rise and sort of quite troubling Serbian nationalism, I just wonder how it's all going to sort of play out with what's going on in Ukraine. So we'll see, and obviously that's outside of our control. But it's interesting sometimes in research, I think, when there's suddenly a huge global event and it impacts on your research, and it kind of almost like you're in a boat at sea, and then there's like this huge gust of wind, and it just kind of pushes you in one direction. So it'll be interesting to see what comes out of that.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
And so you said that the last 2 years you haven't been working on anything related to your kind of like field of expertise.
Well, I guess it's been marginally related. So I finished my PhD, 2019,
Right.
I think, 18, 19. And then I started, I got a postdoc at the Woolf Institute in Cambridge, which is a leader in interfaith relations and sort of the role that religion plays in society, particularly in sort of modern secular society. And the project I was hired to do was to develop a set of indicators to assess the effectiveness of interfaith dialogue.
Oh, right.
So it was something completely different,
Yeah.
something that I've never done before. Essentially, it was sort of a type of impact evaluation, I guess. So it was completely outside of my comfort zone.
Yeah.
I had sort of no idea what I was doing for the first couple of months. But it was really interesting, actually. And a lot of it, in fact, did end up being quite heavily based in social psychology. So there was a lot of intergroup theory going on, contact hypothesis and things like that. And it gave me a real respect for the process of evaluation, which is actually so hard to do.
Yeah, sure.
It is so hard. And now it sort of completely took me out of my comfort zone.
Okay.
And I'm very glad that I did it, but it wasn't a project that I had written myself or that was about moral psychology or anything. So it was nice, in a way, to sort of step back from what you know for a couple of years, do something completely different.
Yeah.
But so now I feel like I'm going to jump right back in. And
Okay. And so what were some of the takeaways of this research? Were there any lessons for
future impact evaluations.
No, I was thinking for like interfaith dialogue, but not even. Or maybe I'll come back to this later. But I'm also wondering about inter-ideological dialogues.
Yeah.
Anyway, sorry. So what were some of the key lessons of the research?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the majority of it sort of backed up what's largely already in the intergroup contact literature. So establishment of trust. Breaking down very black and white thinking in terms of the other, this sort of tribal mentality. All of that is obviously involved. I mean, and it's not just in interfaith work, it's also in any kind of work where there's more than one group, whether that be an ethnic group, religious group. And it's so typical that the moment I finish the project, I just forget everything that I ever...
Right.
I'm racking my brain. Yeah, so it was basically an homage, like a tribute to intergroup contact, really, contact theory. What else? This strange, and it actually relates to one of the questions you wrote, that there's a real disconnect between the people that fund this kind of interfaith work. So this is normally sort of comes from a policy angle. Often it's local governments fund interfaith work. And they just lack the ability to be able to understand the motivations of people of faith. That it's almost like they're talking a different language. They just don't understand it. And one thing that kept coming through to the people that I interviewed who are religious and who are involved in interfaith work, whether that's in the UK or Israel, Palestine, wherever, was that there's no way at the moment of being able to articulate religion in a way that secular funding bodies understand. They think it's something sort of slightly weird and just a bit. But for religious people, it is the essence, in some cases, of their being. It's the prime motivator and affects every aspect of their life. So there's this weird, there's this definite sort of secular religious division that is particularly hard to account for when you're trying to sort of report back to a secular funder to say, look, we've made all this wonderful progress and these two religious groups are now much
best buds.
Yeah. And some of that is that these two groups sort of bond over religious beliefs, religious identities.
Right. Okay.
And that's very hard to sort of translate that back as being an example of success to somebody who's more interested in sort of impact or tangible results or metrics. So there's this, I guess it's sort of indicative of a secular religious divide, really, just playing out in a different context.
Well, what sort of metrics would they use to determine a successful interfaith dialogue?
Well, this was when it became difficult, because how are you defining success. So you could have like a crude metric like, I don't know, number of subsequent funding applications for interfaith work in a particular borough after the initial interfaith activity is finished.
Okay.
But you also find that people who engage in interfaith work are very driven people, that for them it's important that there's some kind of psychological change in the people that actually take part in these interfaith. So they're very concerned about changing attitudes, changing beliefs around the other, or improving attitudes towards the other. And arguably that's harder to report on, unless you just sort of do survey methodology. So it really depends on what level you're looking at success. The model that we came up with was sort of splitting success into these 3 different domains. So you have like a psychological domain of success, which you measure in terms of questionnaires, sort of surveys, these sort of attitudinal measures. Then you've got a community level of success, which arguably funders are more interested in. So this is, how do you demonstrate impact in a community? And that's when it becomes more difficult, I think. For me, anyway, it became more difficult to be able to say, here's a list of indicators that say this project bringing Muslims and Christians together has worked because of the following. And you can see it unfurling and taking place in the community. Arguably, that's... Right. I mean, I find that much more difficult. And then you've got the third domain of success in our sort of created model, which is the societal domain of success, which is a much more historical, looking at more sort of long-term trends of crime and violence and stuff like that. So for me, like I was saying, the really difficult bit for me was coming up with indicators to show success in the community.
Were there indicators of failure before the interfaith dialogue started in the first place?
Oh, interesting. No, there weren't really indicators of failure.
I guess what I mean is, like, was there a problem that the interfaith dialogue was hoped to address?
Right. Well, again, this is where it all becomes this notion of sort of secularity and religion gets really confusing, because in the UK, it's not the same. Interfaith activity in the UK is not the same as in Israel-Palestine.
Sure, yeah.
So in the UK, you often find that the goals are much loftier.
Right.
So the ambitions of the people running the project are to, understand each other better, or to increase community bonding or something like that. In Israel-Palestine, it's like we want to sort of, there's a much more sense of urgency to it. So there's this trend at the moment in UK interfaith particularly to sort of shoehorn interfaith activity into what you might call like just general social cohesion type events. So you'd find a lot of things like interfaith litter picking, interfaith arts groups, interfaith blah, 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 blah. And they were interfaith in the sense that they had people from different religions there. But they were sort of coming together for a non-religious cause. Yeah. And that was enough for them, or for the funders, to say it was interfaith. So yeah, it was interesting. And I was just sort of really struck by the motivation of people who were involved in this kind of thing. Okay. It's really sort of, I don't know, you think I was becoming a bit sort of disheartened with the world and that everything was a bit shallow and pointless. And then you meet these people and they genuinely want to make things better, and it's quite nice. Yeah. Doesn't mean, whether they do or not is,
Yeah, I'm doing a fair bit of work at the moment with like community organisers and this kind of stuff, and they are a special breed of just kind of good folk.
They're just sort of, bless them.
Yeah,
somebody's doing it.
Yeah, absolutely. Funnily enough, I mean, I think I talked about this on the last podcast as well, but it's just really on my mind at the moment. And I hope that Maddie and I will actually write like a full academic paper on it sometime in the next decade. But I often think that the priest is a fundamental social role, and the fact that we've lost the priest from society is really quite a problem, and we've sort of disintegrated that role into community organisers and psychiatrists and doctors and social workers and all this kind of stuff. But none of them bring together all those different roles, like the faith aspect, that thing that you were talking about, that it's like part of your being, the reciprocal aspect that we touched on with like forgiveness and punishment, the community-based aspect, the therapy and care aspects, all that kind of stuff. And I guess sometimes in when you're hanging out with these kind of religious community organizer types, you get a glimpse of what the good priest can be.
I mean, I think you're completely right. The role of a priest, is extremely important.
It seems like just an organic role to me. Like throughout all of human history, we've had a priest or a shaman or something similar.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Until the last blink of an eye, and now it's just totally gone.
Oh yeah, I mean, there's a lot of work done by guys like I can't think of his name. What's his bloody name? He's a huge anthropologist, and I know I'll kick myself. He's done a lot of work on sort of shamanism and how the role of the religious expert or specialist is very, very important. Mm-hmm. And he's right. I mean, they have existed for tens of thousands of years. And how is that role filled now in this secular world?
Well, I sometimes feel like academics also do it a little bit in some fields, like philosophy and psychology and religion and stuff. Because I reckon if I was born 3,000 years ago, I would definitely have been the shaman.
Do you think?
Yeah. Partially just because I'm an introvert and shamans can just go off and
hide in a cave.
Yeah.
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 No, I think you're right. Like, there's particularly the philosopher. I mean, if you think about philosophy, particularly the Middle Ages, a lot of it was sort of among the top priests doing it. It does have sort of a religious heritage, I guess. But yeah, I think you are spot on. It's like who fills this role, this priest function, this spiritual, religious, faith community leader? What seems to have happened actually is that you alluded to, you've got sort of it's splintered into different roles. So you have a therapist, you have a philosopher, you have a religious community leader who take on aspects of what the priest would have done, but the priest himself doesn't. Well, I mean, they do in Catholic communities, but largely in a secular society, that role is now absent, I would say.
So speaking of secular and religious, and the secular subsuming the religious, I guess this is a nice segue to some of the work that you're hoping to do over the next few years, which is about religious, kind of understanding religious practices through a secular lens. Have I got that right? So looking at things like mindfulness and fasting and rituals, I guess, in general, and what the mechanisms are, whether those are things that everyone can benefit from or whether you need to be religious. Tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah, well, this is sort of my current area of interest, particularly with the practice of religious fasting, which is widespread, practiced in all major religions and throughout all history. So it's a common feature of what it means to be religious, but it's very understudied, so nobody really has done any kind of empirical work on exploring the effects that it has on, for example, people's well-being, on social cohesion, on people's sense of identity, their sense of belonging, their sense of connection to God or gods. So it's like this ripe area for research, which is very exciting. And me and a couple of colleagues recently put together a grant proposal to look at precisely this. So we're hoping if it gets funded, then this will be our point of interest for the next couple of years. And one of the things that several researchers are interested in, several funding bodies are interested in, is this idea of what can we learn about religious practices and their impact on well-being, thriving, flourishing. How can we take that and transplant it into a secular context so that people who are not religious also get the same sort of, and I hesitate to use the word spiritual, but the same spiritual benefits as religious people. Is that even possible? And I mean, we've had this discussion before, where is it possible for somebody who is not religious to have a numinous experience, a transcendent experience?
So it's not just about physiological benefits from fasting, that I don't know, clear out my cancer cells or something. It's trying to get the religious experience.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things
without
that
the belief, without the faith.
Exactly.
Okay, right.
So one of the things that has been quite thoroughly studied in religious fasting is the health aspect. So it does have beneficial effects on health, particularly metabolic and cardiovascular outcomes. So that's largely been covered, and also it's way out of my field of expertise. So I'm steering clear of that altogether. But what we were more interested in was trying to assess its effects on well-being and the more sort of fluffy, weird stuff.
Sure. How does one measure whether you had a religious experience? You just ask people?
Yeah, that's a really good question. What sort of branch of science do you use to tackle that? I mean, arguably you just ask them. You just sort of self-report data. You just ask them. But there is work.
I really look forward to some of those answers. Like, yeah, man, like I just hadn't eaten for a week, and I was
suddenly I saw the face
balls.
of Jesus
Yeah.
in the toast that I wasn't allowed to eat. Yeah. But there is amazing work by a guy called McNamara, I can't think of his first name, who looks at like the neuroscience of religious experience, which is pretty cool. And there are particular regions of the brain that sort of light up and everything.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, for me, it would probably just be asking them or getting them to fill out some kind of, religious experience scale, of which I'm sure there is one somewhere. Someone somewhere would have done a religious experience. There's a lot of work that's done. So a guy called Michiel van Elk, who is a Dutch psychologist, does a lot of work on awe and the experience of awe, which is perhaps a secular equivalent of something like transcendence. And he does he has these amazing experiments where he sort of shows people incredible vistas. And for people who are very already high in things like susceptibility and absorption, it reduces their body perceptions. They mark themselves, or they sort of report themselves to be much physically smaller than they actually are, which is really fascinating. And he's doing amazing work that sort of looks at this more experience of awe that is not a religious experience.
Is there a name for that sort of field of study where you look at, it's not quite psychosomatic, but like where there's some manifestation in the body of a psychological experience? So I have another colleague at Cambridge who's done work where, I'm not going to get it right, but they do something like they get people to look up a hill, and the fact that that's like an upward, like it's a challenge to get up the hill, changes other ways that they think. I can't remember what the psychological consequences are.
It sounds cool.
But this also reminds me of like the work that I know Jonathan Haidt did, but I'm sure that there's a lot of others on disgust and things where they'd give people the physiological cues for disgust, and then that would have various psychological consequences. But it seems like you guys are, well, this Van Elk stuff seems almost in the opposite direction, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, his research is actually fascinating, and he's done a lot of research on religious experiences as well. But I don't know what you'd call that sort of branch of psychology. There probably is a name for it, like the psychology of psychedelic experience or something.
Okay.
But that's his niche, and he's doing amazing work.
Okay.
It's pretty cool.
I don't want to bounce around too much, but you just mentioned psychedelics. And I'll probably have a whole other podcast on psychedelics at some point, but that seems to be one area where there's also some interest in kind of what's sort of like synthesizing religious experience or something like that.
Yes. And it's interesting to see whether you could disentangle the two. I don't know, intuitively it feels like a religious experience is a psychedelic experience.
Oh, right, okay.
You don't think?
Well, I was going to ask you before, actually, so how, in academic terms, how is religious experience defined? Like, how do you sort of know when people have had one? Like, when you ask people, did you have a religious experience, or that word you used before, like a numinous experience? So do you explain to them what you mean by that, or do you just leave it up to their interpretation?
I think you just leave it up to their interpretation, really.
Right. Okay.
And I'm pretty sure somebody's done this somewhere to sort of do an analysis on qualitative data about religious experience to see if there's sort of common themes of it. Absolutely, I would bet my left arm
Yeah, right. that exists. Okay.
That exists somewhere,
Yeah.
and B, that if it did, there would be sort of commonalities in people's
Yeah.
experiences.
Okay.
But it's interesting, this question you raised earlier about psychedelics and religion. It's like, are they the same, do you think? Because you can have a psychedelic experience and it not be religious.
Me personally, I have no idea because I'm like so not religious in my bones that I don't
Neither am
know.
I, and this is why I'm sort of coming at this. My entire sort of research life has been to try and understand what it must be like to be religious.
Right.
To understand
Okay.
what it must. What does it feel like to have this incredible experience of closeness, or this sense that there's a divine, supernatural being guiding your every movement? And of course, like the majority of the world, so according to a recent Pew Research Forum survey, 84% of the world is religious or identifies with some religion. So being an atheist, being secular, is actually we're the outliers, we're the strange ones. And it makes me, sometimes I think maybe I'm really missing out on some incredible emotional experience, but I just don't believe that there are such things as supernatural agents.
Well, so I guess that's my thing, is that if I had a very profound experience that was supernatural in character, I'm convinced that my psyche would move immediately to try to interpret that experience in a kind of technical way, what were the chemical antecedents of this experience? What electrically happened in my brain? That sort of thing. It wouldn't be I wouldn't assume that I was literally visited. Yeah, that's right. So, but, I will concede that there are a lot of weird things going on that I'm very open-minded about divine intervention and things. Yeah, so my partner, Maddie, we talk about this stuff a lot because Maddie is not religious, but he's quite mystical. And she just kind of catalogues a lot of this stuff when she comes across it and passes it on to me to try to break down my kind of dry, secular academic attitude to everything. Yeah. And one thing that she told me about recently is there's a large documentation of kids talking about experiences that seems to be from a past life, certainly to their parents, just had nothing to do with that kid, and they seemed quite vivid and things like that. And there's one guy in the US who has tenure and so can fritter away his time tracking down all these cases and trying to see whether there's any sort of interesting patterns, and he's apparently catalogued a whole bunch of them. I'll try to put this research in the show notes, kind of piecing together that some of these kids have memories that do match people that they would never have met, but that were proximate to them when they were born and things like that.
Right.
And the research kind of seems to suggest that it's quite possible that there is some kind of soul that exists after death and etc. And I don't jump to that conclusion, but when I read the research, I'm like, well, that would be one explanation. And so I think it's a good scientific attitude to keep an open mind to that.
Yeah, no, absolutely, keep an open mind. It's funny you said about your mind would automatically leap to try and find some disappointing neurological physiological
boring.
response.
Yeah.
Because I had something really weird happen to me a couple of weeks ago. Have you ever had sleep paralysis?
No.
Oh God, it's so weird.
Yeah, I can imagine.
I woke up and had this utterly terrifying experience. Okay. I could see this black figure sat on the end of the bed and felt like there was somebody there, and I couldn't move. And it was utterly terrifying. And then I must have sort of gone back to sleep again. But I immediately...
So, nothing to be done. I'll just pass out. Hope they're not there when I wake up.
Get a 40 wins.
Yeah.
And And when I did fully wake up, I immediately Googled it and was like, okay, this is the explanation for why it happened. But of course, that's the basis of folklore, like these succubi and incubi, that sort of these demonic beings that sit on the end of the bed. Like, I think there's some Japanese character that's prevalent in folklore. There's the old hag.
The ring,
Yeah. But no, my mind didn't go
But it's
there.
not an explanation, right? I think that's what's kind of... So I've come around a lot in the last year to sort of other ways of knowing, which is a term that used to drive me up the wall. And part of the reason for that is that a lot of scientific explanations, in a sense, aren't an explanation. So if you have this experience where you're like, you have sleep paralysis and you see this shadowy being at the end of your bed, and then you wake up in the morning, you Google it, and some scientist is there being like, oh yes, we call this sleep paralysis. It's now labelled, and we've identified like some part of the brain that lights up when people have sleep paralysis. Like, that doesn't tell you squat. I mean, that doesn't even tell you whether your brain caused the image or whether the image caused the change in your brain. So like, it doesn't. I would still be like, maybe there was some like weird entity at the end of the bed.
Oh no. And again, actually going back to the priest function, presumably, if this had happened like 500 years ago, you would have gone to the priest who would have given you an explanation that is now provided by some neuroscientist in Berkeley, California.
Well, so here's another one where Maddie really helped me out on the ways of knowing things, right? So she says to me that she came across this great example that in the sort of early Middle Ages period, among the Celts, there was a standard sort of folklore telling that sometimes mothers who'd recently given birth would have their spirits whisked away by the fairies to a dark place. And the only way to bring the spirit back from the fairies was to just like spend a lot of time with the mothers, regardless of their mood or whatever, and just kind of, chat to them and be friendly to them and offer them support. And this to me sounds obviously like postnatal depression.
Right. Yeah.
And it is both a explanation in the way we've just talked about of the cause of postnatal depression, or the disease, the state, and the cure. And both of them are articulated in a way that I think would be much more meaningful to an average person and much more actionable and motivating. So it connects to the conative element of our psychology than someone in a lab coat coming to you and saying, oh yes, you've got postnatal depression, your serotonin uptake inhibitors aren't working well, please take these drugs, and, just be patient with the mother while she's despondent. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I think that is an illustration for me of a different way of knowing that in a lot of ways is kind of more effective in terms of the outcomes that we want.
Yeah, and I mean also you could say that explanation of, the spirit has been taken away by the fairies, sort of, it draws on culturally available narratives, culturally available sort of entities that aren't necessarily as available now. So if you said, the cause of postnatal depression, of course, is that fairies come and take away the soul, people would look at you like you're bonkers.
Yeah.
And likewise, had you gone back to Celtic Ireland and said, actually, what's happening here, guys, is this a serotonin issue?
Yeah.
They just would have looked at you like you were mad, presumably.
Yeah.
So perhaps
so we have a potion for that.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe it's all culture bound. Who knows? I mean, I'm sure that plays a huge part.
Well, here's another one of my favourites from Anne Maddie, who actually says that apparently if medicine is delivered in our cultures today by someone wearing a white lab coat, it has more effect than if it's just delivered by some like random punter. Even though chemically it's identical. And these aren't placebos. These are real medicines. They have more effect when culturally situated.
Yes. I mean, I completely believe that.
Right.
I would also, if somebody, I'd broken my leg and ended up in hospital and saw somebody in a lab coat or a doctor, with the scrubs, some guy just wearing a casual pair of jeans, and I think I'd be exactly the same.
Okay, right.
Maybe that's to do with sort of trust in authority figures. I'm sure that back in the 70s people ran really unethical experiments where they just put people in lab coats.
The glory days of psychology.
God.
Yeah.
If only we could go back. No ethics approval.
No.
Just electric babies.
So, on that bright note, we've been talking a lot about, I guess, mystical or religious insights that we're trying to understand with science and having a bit of trouble doing so. I want to kind of reverse that a bit. Are there any religious practices that you're aware of that are, to some extent, better understood now that we've applied a scientific lens? And have any of those lessons from the science been taken back to the religious communities?
Right. Well, that's really interesting. So the example that I can think of is mindfulness. So taken out of its religious context, it's now become an extraordinarily popular sort of phenomenon. You know, everything from mindfulness interventions in primary schools to secondary schools, the military, like everywhere you look, it's been taken out of its original context and transplanted into the secular world, and it's had hugely beneficial effects. You know, reams and reams and reams of research showing that mindfulness has this whole multitude of beneficial effects, such as reduced anxiety. Blah, blah, blah. So that would be, for me, a prime example of a religious practice that originated as a religious practice that has clearly some kind of beneficial effects on the practitioner or the people that's doing the practice, and that has been taken out and transposed to different contexts, and it's had similar beneficial effects.
Okay.
The second part of that question, though, is more difficult to answer, and I can't think of an example where you mean like a feedback loop, if you like. So take, for example, mindfulness. We take this ancient religious practice, find out that it works in schools, workplaces, etc., and then we take what we find from the secular initiatives and come back to the...
Yeah, so it's interesting that you mentioned mindfulness, because this question is partially inspired by some comments from a colleague of mine who said precisely this has happened in mindfulness.
Oh, really? Interesting.
The technique was borrowed from Buddhists originally, and then scientists, having worked with it for a while and identified some of its causal mechanisms and sort of refined some practices, obviously like losing a lot as well in the process. So there's a lot of interesting kind of neuroscience literature showing that when Buddhists are doing stuff as part of a broader practice of Buddhism, the effects can be kind of wider ranging, deeper and stuff than just, again, like someone listening to Sam Harris's mindfulness apps. But she was saying that recently some of these mindfulness scientists have returned to Buddhist communities, and particularly in developing countries. She said she was a bit shocked to discover how sort of mechanically mindfulness was practiced in a lot of Buddhist communities, and that the Westerners, in her estimation, have helped to enrich the mindfulness practice back in those communities that they originally got the idea from.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's what an extraordinary interaction in that case. If true, how wonderful.
Yeah.
However, I do feel like they probably know what they're doing with mindfulness. And that some sort of Western anthropologist comes back and actually goes, you can make it better by doing this, because we've got a mindfulness clinic in Ohio, and actually I don't know how, if I were a Buddhist monk, how receptive I would be to somebody coming in and telling me, hey, we can rework your ancient practice and do it like this. But if it's true, you know, that there is this sort of mutual enhancement, then that's great, fantastic. Also, really interesting what you said about how there was sort of deeper, more broad effects in Buddhist monks partaking in mindfulness as opposed to a secular group in the West. So in this research proposal that we put together on fasting, one of the things we were interested in seeing was whether there would be similar physiological effects in Ramadan fasters versus sort of secular intermittent fasters. and whether there would also be similar psychological sort of identity effects in
Right.
the two. And I just wonder what you thought of that. Do you think so? One of the things that intermittent fasting does is sort of boost the immune system. It sort of improves biomarkers underpinning the immune system. And the study that we had in mind would be sort of a hair analysis where you could sort of track what happens to the immune system and certain sort of markers throughout the course of Ramadan, which is roughly 32 days, I think, and then sort of compare them with a secular group of intermittent fasters who follow the same pattern of fasting for the same amount of time. Do you think there would be different physiological responses between the two groups?
I don't. I know nothing about physiology. I think there would be different psychological effects.
Yes,
but
so do I.
One thing I'd be curious about there is that a lot of people that I come across who do intermittent fasting quite seriously, it is connected for them to some identity. Probably not an identity quite as deep as being a Muslim.
Yeah.
So one that's fairly common is that people who bodybuild for aesthetic reasons often engage in intermittent fasting. So obviously there's like bulking and cutting for bodybuilding contests where you've got to show your ripped physique. But then a lot of people also just like to generally be lean so that they look nice.
Yeah.
And they do intermittent fasting for that. And I guess there the intermittent fasting is pursued for a physiological effect, but that physiological effect is tied to a fairly substantial identity.
Yeah, well, I mean, a couple of things to say. Having done sort of intermittent fasting, varying degrees of success over the past decade, it does give you this feeling of sort of like the feeling of leanness. Sort of, it almost makes you feel like you're floating in a way. It's weird. It gives you like this almost a moral superiority.
Oh, right.
It's really, at least for me anyway. You feel like a better version of yourself.
Okay. I have heard this among anorexics.
Oh,
which is probably not the best comparison yet.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
But, coming back to the proposed study on these sort of seeing changes in biomarkers related to the immune system, then I started thinking, well, maybe you would see a difference between secular fasters and Ramadan fasters. Because in Ramadan, it's like a community activity. So perhaps that sort of the cortisol and the adrenaline that's sort of released during these, because also remember that during Ramadan, every fast is ended with a communal iftar. So maybe that impacts somehow on the more physiological aspects that you don't see in intermittent fasting. There's not the same sort of degree of community.
Yeah.
I don't know. The only way to find out, of course, would be for the funders to fund this study.
Yeah.
Then I could let you know. But I don't know. It plays on my mind. I don't know which way it would go. I think you're right. There'd definitely be psychological differences. Off the top of my head, I would hypothesise that Ramadan fasters would feel much more connected to sort of fellow group members than secular intermittent fasters. But whether it would actually play out physiologically, I don't know.
And so if this study were to get funded, how would you are you planning to set this up experimentally? Are you going to recruit sort of like religious fasters, secular fasters who are, and like secular non-fasters who then start fasting?
Yeah,
and,
the proposed study that one of the proposed studies that we put into the proposal was we'd look at Ramadan fasters in Iran, predominantly Shia Muslims. We'd look at Ramadan fasters in the UK in a predominantly Sunni community, and we'd look at secular equivalents, by which we mean sort of people intermittent fasting for 12 hours a day.
Right.
And that we'd take a hair sample from every participant, and using sort of amazing wizardry, you'd be able to sort of see the changes taking place in the biomarkers underpinning the immune system.
Right.
So you'd have an interesting sort of potential cross-cultural comparison between Sunni and Shia. I don't think you'd see anything physiologically in that case, but you might see sort of different psychological differences between the two. And then you could compare them with the control, i.e. the secular group as well. And that's how we do it. And actually, I think it would be much harder to find a big enough sample of secular intermittent fasters who can hack it for 30 days.
Sure. Yeah, I think you'd have to like get on Reddit or some
it would be really quite
place
difficult.
where they congregate.
Yeah, you'd have to hang around in sort of chat forums with intermittent fasters.
Yeah. But I'm sure there are some big communities of intermittent fasters.
I think you're probably right. And for me, what is interesting is the extent to which they sort of replicate religious communities. Do they have this sort of sense of community that comes with being religious? Or do they develop these really strong bonds? And does that impact on their sort of their fasting practice?
I mean, I feel like the bodybuilding community has some similarities, like definitely not.
Imagine I could sort of hang around in East London gyms.
Yeah. I mean, my only exposure to the bodybuilding community is through like fitness vloggers on YouTube, because I rock climb a lot, and so I have to I cross train in the gym, and so I try to like get info from these kind of sites, and they're very scientifically focused a lot of the time, or at least the ones that I pay attention to. But it does seem like they have their priests, or like, they're people that bring the gospel. They say, this is what you got to do, don't do this, do that. They have their celebrities. They have absolutely got community. They've got their own memes. They've got their own rituals.
Yeah, and they've also got sort of the chemical components as well, like the endorphin release that presumably you get from a religious experience. You also get in exercise.
Yeah.
Particularly if you're really, really into it, it's you get this huge rush. Like I used to do swimming really seriously.
Yeah.
And you got this amazing sense of sort of adrenaline, and a sense that you're flying. It was like it was like what I imagine a transcendent experience is like.
Okay. I hope that a transcendent experience is a bit more than
Can you imagine? That's what it boils down to. That's
Yeah.
the best it will ever be.
just like run really hard for 30 minutes and then
Just swim a couple of lengths.
yeah.
Raise your heart rate.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, you'd hope so. But that, I imagine, is sort of what a religious experience must feel like, but amplify that, 100 times, and you have some idea of what it might be like.
Maybe. I'm not so sure, because I don't know whether religious experience is kind of physiological like that. I would have thought that there was something psychologically novel about religious experience. Like there is some element of it that is inexplicable, and you touched the mystery. Whereas, and when I exercise, I never feel like I was like, well, what was that? Like, you know exactly what it was, right?
Yeah. Also, I guess, what do we mean by religious experience?
Yeah, well, I did ask you that before.
Is it like, oh, did you? Did I not answer it?
No, you give a decent answer.
I mean, if it's like sort of seeing the Virgin Mary at Lourdes, I'd say that probably classified as a religious experience.
Yeah.
But if it's just like, I felt like God was with me.
Yeah.
Is that also religious? I mean, yes, I suppose so.
Yeah, well, some people, I came across a forum once where they were showing microscopic images of snowflakes, these amazing geometric shapes that exist in snowflakes. And apparently, like, no snowflake is the same as any other snowflake, which is crazy when you think about it. Yeah. And some people in this, because it was like a Facebook thread or something, were like, how can you not believe in God when you see this?
Oh, I've seen that so many times. Look at the beauty of this animal. How could you not believe in God when you see that?
Yeah.
Quite easily.
Yeah, quite easily, right? But I guess the point is more that, do they think of, like, does the snowflake generate awe in them? And is that interpreted in a religious way?
Yeah. Well, again, I think what religion does very well is provide a very convenient framework of sort of culturally available explanations. So yes, perhaps they experience all, and they have a very available list of things from which they can interpret that all experience. So, and again, I mean, things like sort of well-being and flourishing, I think for a religious person, I don't know, here's me speaking on behalf of all
this whole conversation, I'd be like, this must feel so cringe for the religious people listening.
But presumably flourishing for a religious person would involve some religious aspect. So you just, whereas for a secular person to flourish, you wouldn't make recourse to supernatural agents or a divine being.
I was going to ask before, in relation to the gym, whether one thing I like about the gym and that I think promotes my well-being is that you can see the progress, like both aesthetically, like you get buffer, but also that you lift more and things like that. Like you can feel your power growing, and I wonder whether similarly for religious people, sustained religious practice helps them feel closer to God or whatever it might be.
Oh, yeah, I think absolutely. So recently we had a guest speaker come to the Woolf Institute who is a leading Muslim theologian, and he was talking about fasting, and he was saying precisely the same thing, that for him and for many people who practice religious fasting, it's the self-control which is so important. And he says that when you do it consistently, so he even fasts, so there are sort of additional fasts that you can do outside of Ramadan, and he does them. And one of the reasons he does it is he says, I can feel my self-control growing and growing and growing. It's almost like, like a muscle that you're working as you would in the gym.
Sure. But does that bring him a religious satisfaction?
Yeah, I think so, because he's doing it, and he was saying that my self-control improves, and that is not just sort of individually satisfying, but also it makes me feel closer to God. I'm doing it for him. So it's a much more sort of rounded experience in the sense that you're doing it not just for yourself, for God.
Something transcendent.
Yeah. Which I thought was really interesting. Because it does require an enormous amount of self-control.
Yeah, I've never been able to
do that.
Yeah.
I last maybe like 4 days on intermittent fasting, and then it just falls apart. I just cannot do it.
So for me, I find I can't do it. I mean, I exercise like 5 days a week pretty hard, and I just can't diet like that, basically. Like my blood sugar levels go a bit wild, and I just get really tired and stuff. I can do the one where you sort of cram all your meals between sort of 11 and 4 and otherwise don't eat. So you get your calories in.
Yes, well, your fasting window, no, your feeding window.
Right, yeah.
Yeah. Yes, yeah.
So that worked okay, but then my partner now sort of is really insistent on breakfast, and that just kind of is a real spanner in the works, yeah. So I don't bother. But this fast where you do like 4 days or a month, where you sort of barely eat for 4 days, I don't think I could do that.
I don't know to either. I mean, but also when you think about like Ramadan, for example, it's not that you just don't eat; you also don't consume any liquids at all.
Oh right, I didn't even know that. Yeah.
Yeah, no water at all. It's like a complete fast from sort of traditionally sunrise to sunset, so it's roughly 12 hours.
Yeah.
But of course, like there are some Muslims in Iceland, who can fast if they abide by the very strict sort of sunrise to sunset. It's 22-hour fast.
Yeah, right.
But generally, what happens there is that they follow sort of the pattern of Mecca.
Yeah, I was going to say, right.
I bet you there are some people who
sure, yeah, do it by the book. Yeah. Okay.
But it's really intense, and to do that for an entire month as well is really pretty amazing.
Yeah. Okay, so we're coming close to the end of our time. So I thought one question that naturally follows from what we've been discussing so far that is also kind of maybe big enough and juicy enough to end on is like, what are some aspects of religion that we're really just like not understanding at all scientifically? So like what are the big frontiers in this area?
Well, I think transcendence. I mean, you could say, well, okay, we've run these brain studies and this area of the brain lights up, and therefore we understand like the neural correlates involved in transcendence. They don't explain transcendence, like you were saying earlier. It doesn't explain it in any way. So, I mean, for me anyway, that's the puzzle of religion. Well, there are several puzzles. One of the puzzles of religion is like this transcendent aspect that's lacking from a secular worldview. The other thing that I think is a big one for religion is understanding the extreme motivation and devotion that it has in people, particularly towards sort of more violent pro-group activities.
Sure.
So sort of religious terrorism, for example, that's like a big one. Like, why would people do this?
Yeah.
What is it about their religious beliefs or their religious cognition? And actually, it's largely not to do with their religious beliefs, actually.
Oh, right.
It's more to do with sort of their group bonds rather than anything sort of evil within the actual religious belief. It's more to do with the type of alignment they have with their group. But that certainly is, I think, for the secular world at least, that's an important question to answer. It's like, why do religious people, what possible reason do they have for doing these wild, dangerous, violent activities?
Okay.
So transcendence, that's a big one for me, trying to understand that. Understanding how religion can underpin violence and war and terror is another big one. I don't know, I feel like for the past 10 years at least, like the discourse has always been, well, we need to bring together religion and science and blah, blah, blah. And, you know, there's like multiple institutes now that sort of look at precisely this. For example, the Faraday Institute in Cambridge, which is above us at the Woolf Institute. And I think people sort of, I don't know, again, I am obviously a product. I live in a bubble. I live in this sort of academic bubble where religion and science are no longer seen as, you know, ill bedfellows like you can do. So for me, it's like, I thought we'd kind of all moved on. I thought everybody just generally thinks that. I mean, we're seeing immense shifts in patterns of religiosity in the world. So there's a huge decline in the West in religiosity. Particularly in Christianity, but people's spirituality isn't going away. So what we're seeing is this huge shift towards what's called nuns, not like nuns.
The no religions.
Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
right, yeah.
So people haven't completely disregarded religion, and it seemed to sort of fly in the face of people who were predicting that the world would eventually become completely secular. It doesn't seem to be happening, and I don't think it will. It's just the way that religion is evolving. What sort of shape, what texture will it take? Also, I'm fascinated to see whether this sort of wave of secularization that's taking place in the West will also take place in other parts of the world.
Yeah,
as well.
Big question for me as well. Yeah.
Because, again, I think it was maybe a Pew Forum, or I remember reading some sort of study to suggest that there was a rise in atheism in the Middle East, which I think was really interesting.
Okay, yeah.
And whether the same patterns will happen there as they have in Europe and the West. So who knows, perhaps.
Yeah, very interesting. All right, well, that was a really nice note to finish on. So thank you, Kitty, for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, that was a really vibrant chat, and look forward to having you on the show again in the future.
Thank you very much.
ePODstemology?
If you enjoyed today's episode, my guests and I would be ever so grateful if you could please leave a review of ePODstemology on whatever podcast directory you use, and share, like, comment, or subscribe if those are options. Tell your friends about the show, and we'll see you next episode.